Well, welcome everybody. I'm Randy, Chief Technology Officer for VDI Laboratory, and it's a pleasure to once again host one of these exciting webinars on various topics of veterinary diagnostics. We started this series not really knowing where it was going to go, but now it's actually sort of taken off, kind of like a life on its own. We've had some exciting guests. And tonight I'm actually quite pleased because I get to introduce Dr. Amanda Marino. Dr. Marino is a veterinarian whose journey has spanned emergency medicine, avian, and exotic specialties, and now integrative veterinary health. I'm also very pleased to say that Dr. Marino is also a very good client of VDI's and has been using us for quite some years, along her and Dr. Pope. Since completing her acupuncture training in 2019, she's been passionately pursuing traditional Chinese veterinary medicine, oncology, integrative nutrition, ozone therapy, and much more. With a strong foundation in both conventional and holistic care, Dr. Marino brings a unique perspective to treating all species, and we're thrilled to have her share her expertise with us today on the topic of silent toxins. Well, welcome, and I thank you for joining us. And without much ado, I think I'll let you just sort of get into it.
All right. So I chose to speak on this because we're all exposed to toxins all day, every day in our home, outside, on the as soon as we step outside. And so I found it really important in some of my really difficult cases that they've had everything done from the conventional, the integrative side, that I find something here and it really makes a difference in my patients. Mm. So, all right. So why are we concerned about environmental toxins? Because they definitely have an impact on our animals' health as well as ourselves. So it can be a part of complex illnesses such as cancer, endocrine disruptions, kidney and liver disease, allergies, immune system dysregulation, and increased inflammation. Our pets are also sentinels for us, that we share the environment, we breathe the same air, drink the same water,
Okay.
walk in the same areas. But because they're so much smaller, the burden can be much more on them. And so they can be early indicators of, the environmental risks that we may be exposed to as well. So there's lots of different things that we can encounter that can be considered toxins. So there's things within our household or indoors. So smoke or aerosols, which can cause respiratory disease and increased cancer risk. Flame retardants that are in a lot of furniture, bedding, electronics, which can cause endocrine disruptions and thyroid disease. All of our cleaning products and disinfectants can cause GI upset, corrosive injuries, chronic irritation. Air fresheners, candles, essential oils, if not used correctly, can cause respiratory irritation. And then we have heavy metals in old paint and even in dust. And there could be arsenic, so neurologic diseases and anemia. Then we have our outdoor exposures. So pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, all these have been linked to cancers, neurologic disease, even acute poisonings. Fertilizers and lawn chemicals that can cause GI upset and have possible carcinogenic links. Antifreeze, which we know causes acute kidney injury, and then de-icing salts, which can cause irritation both in the GI and topically, and sodium toxicity. Other areas include our food and water. So in our food, and especially in our animals, mycotoxins. Mycotoxins can also be from the environment. Cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, which can be in bodies of water, heavy metals, and then our plastics, which can be endocrine disruptors. Then we have air and environmental pollution. So particulates, which cause respiratory and cardiovascular strains, are volatile organic compounds, which can cause neurologic and liver stress, and then radon gas, which causes an increased risk of cancer. Things I don't have listed here are also things that we expose our pets to, like vaccines with heavy metals and adjuvants, medications. This is only a small picture of what we can be exposed to, or what our pet can be exposed to. So how can we evaluate for environmental exposures? So one thing I always do is like to put tools in the hands of the owners to try and have them um, be active in the care of their patient and figuring out where they can improve upon things. Because in the long run, it's not just helping their pet, it's helping them. So as household products, there's the EWG Healthy Living app that can be used to search like personal care items, cleaning and household products. It'll give like a safety range, an ingredient breakdown, and a toxin alert. And so, as I said, it helps alert the owners to everyday exposures. And so it's good for the pet, but also for yourselves. Then, as far as the environment by location, we can look at air quality. So you can go to airnow.gov and put in your zip code, and it'll let you know about the air quality in your area. Water quality is another really big one. So EWG also has a tap water database that you can look at, local tap water contaminants. And then toxic sites like food super fun sites, the EPA has these maps of this hazardous waste, because back before there were laws on what we needed to do with those hazardous waste, sometimes it was just dumped in areas. And living in a state like New Jersey, there really isn't an area that isn't a Superfund site. So it can be an important thing to help guide if there's specific things we need to look at in a patient, or if there are things that we need to focus on for the care of that patient. Then there are also diagnostic tests, like the one at VDI Labs. Um, they're testing like the vitamin D inflammatory markers. I do those on all of my patients. But now that they have these more advanced environmental exposure testings, the mineral and toxic metal for analysis, the urine glyphosate and mycotoxin testing, these are also additional tools in my toolbox that I find very helpful for a lot of my patients, and to build that comprehensive personalized treatment plan. And these tests can be done individually, or they can be done as a combo panel as well. So starting off with the mineral and toxic metal fur analysis. So this is a non-invasive test that uses only a very small amount of fur, and it reflects more of our chronic exposure to our minerals and toxins. So our blood work has, many of these minerals like the sodium, calcium, potassium, chloride on them, but the blood is highly regulated. And so you may have disparities or from what you have on this for analysis with what you have on blood work. And so it can give you a more long-term exposure. So this test measures 16 nutrient minerals, 10 environmental minerals, 4 toxic metals, and 7 mineral ratios. So it provides a metabolic and toxin burden profile unique to each pet. So why is this important? So it can be used as early detection to reveal hidden environmental exposures before overt disease. There's also some studies out there that having a high sodium potassium ratio, I believe, and a low calcium level can also be early indication of inflammation. Also, selenium, copper, zinc imbalances are also really important in cancer treatment. So early detection and being able to manipulate and fix some of these imbalances can help long-term health. That it's a chronic perspective. So, blood and urine only reflects recent exposure, while the fur has a more long-term accumulation. And it allows us to provide more individualized care, guiding nutrition, detoxification, and case management. And then, as I said, pets are a sentinel role. So if we are having, exposure to things that are in the environment, like boron for say is one that I find come up on the environmental part of the test, based off of where people may live. So how these things can also, potentially be affecting the people. So, when you're looking at this test and how, these contribute to disease, you have your individual mineral imbalances that can cause issues. But there's also these mineral ratios. And as I said, certain things can be indicatory of certain diseases. And then we have our heavy metals and toxins. So, the big ones that we see, mercury is probably one of the most common ones that I have come up in my patients that are fed primarily fish-based diets. I had one animal test positive for lead at one point as well. And so, sometimes we can catch it before we see the neurologic, renal, or immune system dysfunction. Arsenic can cause skin and GI issues and have carcinogenic potential. And then we have cadmium and aluminum that can cause kidney damage, oxidative stress. Aluminum has also been shown in certain sarcomas to have a buildup of aluminum. So knowing these things can be important. Then we also know that toxins displace essential minerals, impair enzymatic pathways, and promote chronic inflammation. And now also on the fur report, if patients have a low calcium, selenium, copper, magnesium, iron, zinc, or manganese, it indicates to you to potentially do a mycotoxin panel because enough of these tests have been done to see that that was a common comorbidity or co-finding with the cases. So, there's lots of different clinical signs that can be seen, and they can range from being like non-specific, chronic problems like lethargy, poor appetite, weight loss, skin and coat changes like dull coat, alopecia, dermatitis, neurologic signs, so tremors, seizures, behavioral changes, GI disturbances like vomiting, diarrhea, and chronic enteropathies, renal hepatic disease, as well as endocrine disorders. All right, moving on to the next test is glyphosate. So this is one of the most widely used herbicides. It actually was patented first as an antibiotic, so it can cause some pretty big changes in the body. It's primarily actually mostly found, and we're getting exposure from the commercial food supply and contaminated water. Not as much from the parks and lawn treatments, but how it's getting into our food and water. And again, this test provides an objective data on the environmental chemical exposure in your pet. So glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. So IARC classifies a lot of these pathogens, even if they have not been labeled as carcinogens. And it's been on the list, I think, since about 2015, but it is still legal as of last time I checked to use in the United States. Many of the other countries in the world have banned the use of it, or at the time of its adding to this list, they were to be phased out in 5 to 10 years, but in the United States, this is still primarily used. And it's heavily used on our GMO products and our like corn, soybean, and wheat, which is what makes up a lot of the kibble-fed foods that are fed to our dogs and cats. It interferes with endocrine function and the gut microbiome, and it's definitely been linked to cancer risks. There's definitely multiple class action lawsuits that have been won against against glyphosate, so there is definitely a link. Chronic GI issues and immune dysregulation, and then pets are at high risk due to ground contact, grooming, and like I said, I think diet is one of the biggest exposures. So how does glyphosate contribute to disease? So again, microbiome disruption, I think, is a really big one. So it causes dysbiosis, leaky gut, and food sensitivities. It can cause oxidative stress and inflammation, which accelerates chronic disease, and endocrine disruption, so particularly the thyroid and reproductive impacts, and its carcinogenesis. So it elevates the cancer risk with long-term exposure. So as I said, clinical signs: chronic GI upset, vomiting, diarrhea, IBD-like symptoms, skin and coat issues. So those itchy dogs, and it's a lot of the times linked to gut dysbiosis, recurrent infections due to immune compromise, and then poor cancer prognosis or aggressive cancer development. The last test is the mycotoxin test, which detects toxic fungal metabolites produced by molds. This is primarily from contaminated foods or feeds, but it can also be in water damaged environments. It's a snapshot of the hidden toxin exposure contributing to chronic illness, and this test tests for 16 mycotoxins from 5 different groups. So why is it important? Mycotoxins are highly toxic, carcinogenic, and immunosuppressant. It can also be associated with liver and kidney failure, chronic inflammation, and that increased cancer risk. And there really is no blood test, for this. There are some other tests available to test for some of the specific pathogenic, fungi or based on your location, that could be more common. But we're all exposed to molds of some kind pretty much on a daily basis, and these toxins that could be produced by that. So mycotoxins can contribute to disease by being hepatotoxic. So aflatoxin can cause oxidative stress, necrosis, and cancer. Nephrotoxic, the ochratoxin is linked to chronic kidney disease. Immunosuppression, fumosinins, and the trichothecenes impair immune function. And then carcinogenesis, so like aflatoxin B1 is one of the most potent known carcinogens. Clinical signs could be unexplained liver and kidney enzyme elevation, PUPD weight loss, poor appetite, chronic GI upset, inflammatory bowel disease, like signs, immune dysfunction, and aggressive or unexplained cancer development. So I'll show in the 2 cases the way that the test is reported and kind of review those things. But just to, before I get into the cases, do a treatment overview. So the goals of therapy are to reduce future exposures. So really talking with the clients about diet, getting them onto a less processed diet, making sure that they're looking into other areas of exposure, like water, air, and making sure that we're getting rid of as much exposure as possible. Support detoxification pathways, to replenish the depleted nutrients and minerals, and monitor progress for follow-up testing. As I said, approach is environmental management, so diet, water, and home, medical nutritional support for detoxification, and then retesting, as you're going along to be sure that you're seeing improvement, and that you don't need to make adjustments. So environmental management, again, diet is something that every client that comes into our office is talked about, that we want that highest quality diet. So where we can, organic, non-GMO, human grade, non-synthetic multivitamins, do it, whether that's home cooked or some of the commercially available properties, but doing as much as we can to limit exposure from the food, because that's probably one of the most common places that we see exposure. Using filtered water. So really, the only thing that's going to get everything out of the water is reverse osmosis, and that's even taking your minerals out. So depending on the system, if you have reverse osmosis, whether you need to supplement minerals or whether the system is adding it back in. There now are some like countertop reverse osmosis systems that are available instead of having to have a plumber come to actually put the system in. Then there's things like Berkey that are not quite as good as reverse osmosis, but it's pretty darn close. Things like your fridge filter really are not getting much out, like your Brita filters and things are slightly better than your refrigerator filter. And the thing with bottled water is who knows where it's coming from. Like it might be spring water, but if it's spring water from a spring next to a golf course, it's going to be full of stuff. So again, looking into things, having your water tested, your soil tested, is definitely things that can be done. Reverse, so reduce household chemicals. So that's where like using that EWG can be helpful, and that you can review what product you're using and see if there's something cleaner, because that's not just beneficial for your pet, that's also beneficial for you. Indoor air quality can be improved with like HEPA filters for filtration. And then if you have concerns about mold and mycotoxin, that home remediation by a professional may be needed. So as far as treatment, you can't get rid of these things without making sure your phases of detoxification are working. So there are three primary phases of detoxification. Phase 1 and 2 are really by those chemical mechanisms within the body to process, where phase 3 is more of an elimination. So phase 1 is activation, and this is primarily done with the cytochrome P450, where it converts toxins into reactive intermediates, and it requires things like B vitamins, flavonoids, and antioxidants. Phase 2 is conjugation. And so the one important thing I always try to remember is cats are really poor phase 2 detoxifiers. And so when we're picking supplements and figuring out how to treat, I caution to do too much in phase 2 because that may be too much for some pets. In cats particularly. But this is attaches molecules like glutathione, which comes from vitamin C, sulfate, glycine, and others to make toxins water soluble. And so it requires glutathione, sulfur amino acids, magnesium, and selenium. And then the last phase is elimination, which is moving those conjugated toxins either out of the body through bile, urine, stool, sweat. And this requires hydration, fiber, bile flow support, and microbiome health. So in each of these areas, there's a number of nutrients that can be used. So phase 1, like the B vitamins, glutathione, vitamin D, which is we know is very important. This is where milk thistle is really also very important. We always think about it as a liver support, but it's really particularly supportive in phase 1 of detoxification. Phase 2 is more of those amino acids, cruciferous vegetables because of the sulfur and acetylcysteine, glutamine. And then phase 3, again, is that elimination. So microbiome testing and restoration, the pre and probiotics. If we're really backed up, things like the triphala, which is an Ayurvedic blend, magnesium, purgatives like the senna, rhubarb, and the demulcifant herbs like the slippery elm and licorice or the smooth move tea can be used. Alteratives are a group of herbs that support the organs of detoxification. Algae, and then increasing water flow, water intake, and then humic and fluvic acid extracts. So one is to support detoxification, but depending on the severity of the levels in my patients, if they have significantly elevated levels, I will be using like binder detoxification supplements to help get rid of some of those things quicker. So these substances bind toxins in the gut and prevent reabsorption through, which is usually performed through enterohepatic circulation. It forms complexes with the toxins so that they can be eliminated through the stool and urine. And they're used in detoxification protocols to lower the systemic burden. And some of the broad spectrum binders that can be used include activated charcoal, zeolites, clay minerals, humic fulvic acids. So there are some things that are particularly better for different toxins than others. So for like heavy metals, the sulfur containing binders bind the metals for excretion. Pretty much all binding supplements I use alongside, like use a mineral supplement alongside to prevent displacement. Glyphosate, humic fulvic acid blends are shown to capture the glyphosate residue and support microbiome repair. And then for mycotoxins, the clay minerals, charcoal can strongly bind aflatoxins, and the humic and fulvic substrates broaden the binding spectrum to less polar mycotoxins. Medical ozone is another great tool that is sometimes used for detoxification. So ozone supports detoxification by stimulating phase 2 detoxification and antioxidant defenses, and improves oxygen utilization. So again, it reduces oxidative stress, and enhances mitochondrial function. It helps the immune system by balancing inflammation that may be associated with the toxin burden, and it can also be helpful from a microbiome perspective to control pathogenic, bacteria, fungi, biofilm that may worsen toxin exposure. And this can be used for chronic disease and cancer patients to support the clearance of, the toxins that impair immune function. The mycotoxin exposure so ozone has a direct antifungal effect and supports the liver. For glyphosate and heavy metals, it enhances the antioxidant defense, mitigating the oxidative stress, and it works synergistically with a lot of our nutritional and herbal detox support. So as far as monitoring, it's important to regularly monitor our patients. The thing is detoxification takes time. We don't really have good testing to look at how well a patient truly detoxifies. And so in a person that has all of their detoxification pathways open, it takes about at least 3 months for detoxification. So for many of our patients, it's going to take 6, 12 months potentially to fully detoxify. And that's if they're not having continued exposure. But these tests allow you to track their clinical response and not just, the clinical signs that we're seeing, and being able to adjust the protocol as we see these levels change over time. So I have 2 cases, well, it's technically 3 cases, but 2 of them are kind of related that I am going to discuss with you. So the first one are Emma, or Tess and Emma. So the owner originally presented with Tess, who was a 5-year-old spayed female border collie that had recurrent diarrhea. And so this dog had been completely worked up from the internal medicine side. When she started to have diarrhea, she was treated with metronidazole. But once it was discontinued, it recurred. She was treated again with the metronidazole. And then when that did not resolve the problem, she was put on Tylenol and Hill's Biome. At that point, additional testing was also performed. So the dog was, negative for GI parasites. They did a GI panel from Texas A&M, and she had low cobalamin and a high TLI. They went as far as doing an endoscopic biopsy and really didn't find much. Maybe she had some mild IBD. Then they decided, which I'm always happy when the internists actually do this, but they did a Texas A&M dysbiosis index, and they found that there was imbalance, including the Clostridium here, where it's not Clostridium hirenosis anymore, but at the time it was still labeled as that. So they did perform an FMT, and she was continued on this biome and B12. But the owner really wanted to get her off of the Hills biome, but every time she tried, she was unable to. So we did some diagnostic tests. So a lot of the initial markers were pretty normal, that her vitamin D was sufficient and her CRP was optimal, which was great. And then we had some mild changes on the fur and heavy metal testing, that could indicate, some inflammation and or that something else was underlying. What really got us our answer was this glyphosate. This was at the time one of the highest glyphosates I had seen. She also had a mild trichothecene exposure, but it was really that glyphosate level that I was like, wow, I think this might be our culprit. And so we started tests on some treatment and supported her with, detoxification. So phase 1, she was already on the B12 injections. We added in some trace minerals and milk thistle for some more liver support. We added in the glutamine because that's, not only good for phase 2 detoxification, but it's also a good amino acid for helping the gut. And then she was already on the probiotics, but we added in humic and fulvic acid. And then I did add a detoxification supplement. We use some different products than what is recommended typically on the VDI lab work, but they're still similar in that in this case, we use Cellcore biotoxin binder. which has a bioactive carbon. It had that broccoli sprouts, which is also important in phase 2 of detoxification, and yucca root, which is more from the phase 3 standpoint. So as we were working up tests for this, the owner also realized that Emma, her other dog, who was only a 10-month-old puppy, also had loose stool basically since adoption. So while we were waiting to get Emma into the hospital to do some testing on her, the owner started to look into her environmental, potential for environmental exposures. And so she uses a filtered water system, but the water was tested and was negative for glyphosate. The owner also contacted the town and tested the water prior to even going through the system, and they report that there's no glyphosate. The owner does live on a large property. The dogs were primarily walked on gravel and didn't really even touch the grass, but she spoke with the landscapers and they said they did not use any treatments on the property, and the soil level was relatively low for glyphosate. The owner was interested but had not yet tested herself, and she wasn't really interested in sending the food out, which I was a little suspicious may have been our culprit. But we still haven't done that. The owner was actually looking to see if they could have someone come out to the property to be sure that there wasn't any other toxin testing or anything else that should be tested in the environment. But as I said, at this time, she started to think, okay, well, Tess has been exposed, and Emma, who at the time was a 10-month-old intact female Keeshond, was also having loose stool. And so she wanted to look into evaluating Emma as well. So when Emma was adopted, the owner initially fed her carnivore, which caused her loose stool. She attempted to transition to Darwin's because previously all of her dogs had been fed Darwin's and did really well, but her diarrhea actually got worse. So because Tess was on the Hills biome, she just switched her over to Hills biome, and her stools were not normal, but the closest it was to normal. She had fecal parasite testing that was negative, but she was also prophylactically dewormed because she was a puppy. So again, we didn't do full testing on her because the owner felt like the glyphosate was the most important and she was otherwise a young puppy. So we focused first on the glyphosate level, which again was quite elevated. And so when you see these reports, because I didn't talk about the first time, there's a couple of different numbers here. So there's the glyphosate, which is the actual measure of the glyphosate molecule. The AMPA is kind of the metabolites. And then the effective glyphosate is taking those two numbers together because it's kind of the overall effect of the glyphosate on the body. And so then we pretty much moved Emma to be on the same treatment plan as Tess. For now, the owner elected to keep them both on the Hills microbiome diet. And so this owner lived in Massachusetts and we practice in New Jersey. And so we didn't necessarily test as often as I would have liked, because normally I'd say like 3 to 4 months I'd like to retest. So we ended up getting it done in 8 months. Either way, those numbers were so high that they probably, needed that much time. So there was significant improvement, but the numbers were almost normal, but not quite. Also, like in people, they want that effective glyphosate level to be ideally less than 1 if possible. So I always try to shoot for the lowest I can get, but of course within reason, considering that some of my pet patients are going to potentially have a higher level just because they have a little bit more exposure. So since we saw such an improvement, we went ahead and continued their previous treatment plan, and they had been stable with their treatment and the diet. The owner was most concerned about changing Emma's food because she's a longtime Keeshond owner and was concerned about like her liver and copper storage disease and things like that. And she didn't necessarily want to change food on both of the dogs at the same time. So 15 months later, so again, not as much as I wanted to, we were able to recheck the levels. So Tess had stayed on the Hills microbiome food. but had otherwise been stable, and there was a slight increase in her glyphosate level, nothing substantial though. And then for Emma, the owner had just started working on transitioning her to less processed diets. So I don't think that we necessarily saw the effect of that. But because these numbers did not continue to go down, they actually jumped up. I did switch their treatment plan a little bit in that I switched the binder that I was using to Cellcore's HMET, so it's heavy metal environmental toxins, because it is a little bit more specific for the heavy metals and um, environmental toxins, and it's slightly different in that instead of it just being primarily the charcoal, it has more of, or the carbon technology, it's zeolite, humic and fulvic acid, and then it still has that broccoli sprouts. So this was just tested in, I think it was about April, May. So we're coming up on hopefully retesting them in, I think I wanted it done like the middle of September. So I'm interested to see where this goes and if we can, get them off of the completely off of the processed food. Emma at this point is doing well on the gently cooked foods. Tess, I'm suspecting we may need to do a little bit more microbiome support for and testing, because it hasn't been tested in quite some time. So that's probably the next steps for tests. All right, so moving on to Asher. This is another recent case. He's a 2-year-old male neutered Cocker Spaniel. And like most of them, he presented for recurrent allergy problems, so dermatitis, otitis, and pyoderma. So the clinical signs started in Florida, where they spend most of their winter and spring. And the owner was hoping when they came back to New Jersey that that would subside. But unfortunately, it didn't. And so he had previously been managed with a combination of Apoquel cytopoint injections, various topical and systemic antibiotics, and antifungals. Currently, he's still receiving Cytopoint monthly, and his diet was raw, but varying brands like Stella and Chewy's, Small Batch, Dr. Marty's. So again, I talked to her specifically about picking those higher quality brand raw foods that are organic, non-synthetic multivitamins. When they're in Florida, you can't necessarily get away from the damp environment, but they also live in a gated community that sprays despite them not wanting to. So again, there was definitely exposures. And so I did the diagnostics, but before I got the results back, we went ahead and started treatment. So we did some supporting supplements. One of my go-to herbs for allergies, especially when it goes around those liver gallbladder channels, is Longnan-Shaygantan. Quercetin is a mast cell stabilizer that scuttles alterative, which supports the organs of detoxification. And I suspected that this dog had significant inflammation, so turmeric. We also went ahead and started medical ozone for major and minor autohemotherapy. And we were aggressive because the owner was only up in New Jersey for another 5 weeks. So we did it twice weekly for ideally 5 weeks. And so we initially started to see improvement with the treatment plan, but about 3 weeks in, I was noticing that we were starting to see minor signs reappear, like some inflammation in his ears that I cleared up, like the small rashes on his belly, but they kind of slowly started to pop back up. And basically, once I got the diagnostics, I think I figured out why. So again, the basic diagnostics of vitamin D, which was sufficient. The CRP was mildly elevated. We also have started to look at canine haptoglobin, because I'll get a lot of patients that I have a normal CRP, which I don't think is I don't want to say accurate, but because of depending on the phases of when inflammation is happening or the underlying disease, that maybe we're not seeing that CRP elevation. So we started to add in haptoglobin, and that's something that we'll be working further with the VDI to determine its usefulness. And then again, we had some of these mineral imbalances that were indicative of potential other toxin exposure. Surprisingly, his dysbiosis index was normal. I don't know if this was because he's a younger dog and it hasn't yet affected his microbiome or because he was on a raw diet. Likely along the way, we'll do some further microbiome testing. I tend to always start with the Texas A&M dysbiosis index because I think it's the easiest to interpret and to get some baseline information. Um, but I've been exploring VDI's microbiome panel a little bit further because not only does it look at bacteria, but it also looks at, fungal. So I definitely think that when I need more in-depth evaluation, that could really be helpful. Um, then we got back the other two toxin tests, and I think this explains some of why he has persistent signs, but also potentially why I started to see some improvement and then potential progression. So the glyphosate was again quite high. And then we had, the presentation of 4 of the 5 mycotoxins. And so we know that this can both be linked to microbiome disruption, which leads to allergies, as well as, the skin being another microbiome of itself. And so what I suspected happened is that because ozone can be detoxifying, is that we started to see improvement because we were treating the underlying inflammation, supporting his immune system, and getting that immune system working. But was I also starting to mobilize some of those toxins faster than he was able to get rid of them? And so we had to come back in and further support his detoxification. So I kept him on the majority of the supplements he had previously been on. I added an Inflamaway, which is a Natura product that is a blend of herbs for inflammation. And then again, I added binders. I typically always start with the Cellcore biotoxin binder because it gets a pretty broad range of things. And it's the most gentlest. So I always start with that one. And then we added in some trace minerals. So we went ahead and continued the major and minor autohemotherapy. He had his last treatment with us like a week ago, and he's establishing care with a veterinarian in Florida who's hoping to continue the medical ozone, and we'll kind of continue with follow-up to kind of see how he continues to do. So in conclusion, environmental toxin exposure is widespread in our companion animals. It can be linked to immune dysfunction, chronic inflammation, cancer, other complex health challenges. The diagnostics from VDI are very helpful and provide us insight into individual burdens and allow us to have personalized plans. Detoxification strategies include binder supplements, nutritional support, medical ozone, and by integrating toxin awareness, testing, and treatment, we can improve outcomes in our chronic and treatment-resistant diseases, empower pet owners to reduce exposure in their homes, and advance integrative and preventative veterinary medicine. That these tests can be used preventatively to help find a problem before it actually becomes a clinical problem. All right, I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much. That's been quite illuminating. Every time one of these things happen, we have one of these sessions where we bring guests on. I learn so much. I've learned a lot from you, and I really want to thank you for that.
No problem.
Speaking about the sentinel role of animals and how it might apply to their pet parents, we had a case just recently where it was in Pennsylvania during the winter, where the pet had came down with mycotoxin, and it turned out that the pet parent's home had a humidifier that had gone bad, filled up the HVAC system full of moisture, causing then mold and contaminated the whole house. But the pet parents didn't know. And prior to them, investigating the dog, the wife ended up having all sorts of breathing problems, nasal problems. She even went and had nasal surgery performed,
Hmm.
only to find out that it was the mycotoxins in the household that was causing all the problem due to a humidifier that had gone uh, wacky.
Yeah. I
So
was going to say from personal experience, air conditioners, like the air conditioning units in the windows, like in my apartment, um, like I noticed there's all this black stuff in it, and I had to call my landlord, and I'm like, I think there's mold in all my air conditioners. Can you please come and have them cleaned or change them? Because like last winter, I got sick with some kind of virus, um, and I couldn't stop coughing for months afterwards. And I think it was just the perfect storm of
yeah.
all the things.
And one of the things we get from our clients a lot, you talk about with these three cases, glyphosate and mycotoxins, is okay, well, they're there, and you've clearly identified them being sort of at the root cause. And I'm going to ask you some more questions about the detoxification strategy, which is quite interesting. But the first step is trying to, if you don't stop the source of them, I
Hmm.
mean, you can detox till the cows come home, you're going to still continue to have problems. And so I'm kind of curious what your, strategy is in helping pet parents find where these problems are coming from to begin with. Now, with glyphosate, it's mostly coming from
Hmm.
food. I mean, but I was interested to see the fact that usually it's GMO products, and none of these patients seem to be using any GMO products. Where do you think all this stuff is coming from, and how do you help them find the source?
Yeah. So I think a lot of my patients, again, currently this is changing, but most of my patients are already coming to me with chronic disease and or cancer. And so they may have seen multiple other specialists. I've dealt with things from the conventional side, but they don't necessarily link certain events in their life that could be contributing. And so one I think is really getting a detailed history from the owner. Like I want to know where they traveled, where they've lived, what they've been exposed to, whether, even though they think it's never been a problem that they, have had hot spots or needed medication for their skin, but have they been itchy? Have they all had a sensitive stomach? So I think it all starts from the history to kind of pinpoint things. A lot of my clients, again, do come in because they've seen conventional doctors that they are primarily on a kibble fed, processed food diet. And so, like I said, I still think diet plays a role. I think that there is also a very good likelihood that even though now there's such a range of in the pet food industry of even our less processed food, like a range in the quality of our raw, a range in our quality of our gently cooked, that there are definitely ones that are better than others. And so even though we think they're feeding a good diet, I still like to look into it because sometimes I'm surprised. Um, and then, as I said, like using some of the resources that I mentioned, like looking at how the household and where things can be improved. If I'm getting high levels of things back where we're not knowing where they're coming from, are the owners willing, which most of my clients are, to test the water, to test the environment, like and kind of doing all that. I think another big part of it that I didn't talk as I kind of mentioned it. Um, but these exposures are usually happening slowly over time, and it's kind of building up in their systems. Not saying there can't be acute exposures, but I think a lot of it is chronic exposures.
Yeah.
And like we have no way of really looking at our patients and testing their detoxification. That every person is different. Like in humans, we have the ability to like do genetics and know if we have our MTRF1 gene and other things that may make us poor detoxifiers. And I think there's some like blood tests that are not really commonly used and may not even be available anymore, but there's some tests to determine how well we detoxify, and we don't really have any of that for our pets. So it's also looking at the individual pet and how um, we're seeing that treatment plan progress and using the reevaluation of and retesting to adjust how we need to adjust that plan and where else we may need to look at. Water, I didn't mention that, is another big one. Like glyphosate is pretty much an all of our water supplies. The half-life of glyphosate is over like 200 years. Like it's in our soil no matter what.
It is, and
Um,
it's also water soluble. So
right.
that means it just goes straight into the ground. I read a very interesting article on how
Yeah.
it's basically filling our soil. It goes
Yep.
into the water table. It just runs and runs
Yeah.
and
I mean,
runs and
it's
goes
stripping it
everywhere.
of minerals, it's stripping it of
Yeah,
diversity. It's pretty much like destroying our land.
it is. It's pretty terrible,
Yeah.
and yet we continue
Um,
to spray tons and tons and tons of it.
yeah. But a
Yeah,
lot of owners think they're doing good, like using their fridge filter or like a Brita filter and or bottled water. And the thing is that that's still it's better, I guess, but it's still not good
right.
enough. And there's only
So,
so much we can do.
um, I had the same question, and I see our audience also has the same question on the detoxification.
Yep.
So you have three phases. Very
Yep.
cool. I love it. Um, do you do them all at the same time? Do you detox? Do you go them in stepwise fashion? What exactly is your protocol in that stepwise, well,
Yep.
the three phases, let me just say. I don't know if it's stepwise or
Yep.
not.
So I think it depends on the patient. And the results that I have and what else is going on in that patient. Like the cases that I used here, they were kind of high numbers, but healthy-ish patients. Like they were all young and, you know, really didn't have any other like major disease processes. So them I felt like I could hit pretty hard and kind of do, multiple phases and actually add in binders. But really, you're not going to be able to, the binders are really not going to be overly effective until you have these phases of detoxification open. Because you may be mobilizing things with binders, but if these phases of detoxification are not open, you're not gonna be able to get rid of them. And so, like, a lot of these things we're doing anyway to some degree. Like our vitamin D, vitamin C falls into phase one. That something as simple as cruciferous vegetables like falls within phase two. um, and then a lot of for a lot of my patients, because there's chronic disease and things, microbiome restoration I think is also
Oh, it's huge. I
quite
can't tell you. I mean, you,
yeah.
you mentioned we do stool microbiome, which we do, and I see so
Yeah,
many of these patients that are just unbelievably messed up in their microbiome.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so depending on the patient, I may start supporting some of these phases of detoxification a lot of the times inadvertently, even before like I start getting all the testing back, because I'll be using some of these things depending on the case anyway. But like I said, if I have a really debilitated cancer patient, I may have to come in and really support them first to try and get those detoxification pathways open, before I start trying to mobilize all of those toxins with something like
Mm,
a
interesting.
binder. Granted, if I have a really fast moving cancer, then sometimes it's kind of the choosing what's going to be our best option on the individual case.
Mm. You made mention, which I didn't know, that glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic.
Hmm.
And I said, well, that can't be true. And so I looked it up while you were talking. I did it. And in fact, yeah, in 2010,
Yeah.
it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
It was patented as an antibiotic. And I was like, wow. And one of the things that we see, because we do, not only do we look at the bacteria, but we also do count. We look at the bacteria count. And
Yep.
I've noticed that in some patients, the bacteria count can actually be quite suppressed,
Hmm.
with and flora depressed. And now that I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering to what extent I'm gonna actually go back and take a look to see
Hmm.
what if these patients were had high levels of glyphosate or not, to see if there
Yeah.
might be some corollary. But that's pretty crazy.
Yep.
Antibiotic.
Yep.
I did not know that. Um, Monitoring.
Yep.
What are you talked about monitoring and intervals and how long it might take. Do you have set intervals for monitoring? What would you advise people on the
Yeah.
time windows?
So typically, once I kind of start a protocol, I usually wait at least 3 months before I start rechecking. So depending on the levels and the finances of the owner and things like that. Like if they had really high levels and the owners have some financial concerns, like I may push it out to 6 months, because the likelihood that I'm going to have a full response in 3 months, I think is probably going to be minimal. Because you saw like with Tess and Emma that I didn't retest till 8 months, which was partially just because the owner was at a distance. But like we were just at what is considered normal, like at the 8 month mark. If I see, and I guess it depends, because if I'm using like the fur heavy metal testing and really like looking at more of like the mineral information, that I might move up a little bit more, because again, depending on like cancer patients and looking at like that selenium, magnesium, copper, zinc, like just certain things may be more
Yeah.
important
Yeah,
at certain times.
hair cycle is about 2 to 3 months, depending upon the
Yeah.
breed anyway. So you got to wait at least that
Yeah.
long if you're really trying to get a time window. Okay, we're almost up on the time. A couple. Why not synthetic vitamins and minerals?
Well, because they're synthetic. So, I mean, to me, science is great. Like it's so amazing the things that we have made, but a lot of the times, like nature made things for a reason. So if we can balance a diet with a whole food, it's going to be more easily digestible, probably more easily absorbed, more easily utilized within the body. And so again, that's like the gold standard. There's levels beyond that. And will I say that I don't eat processed food or don't use, things? No, we also have to live with what's within our lifestyle. And so sometimes synthetic vitamins are, necessary, but also like when you look at a kibble-based food and more than half of your label is synthetics versus a gently cooked food that may still have synthetics, but maybe there's only 4 or 5, like that to me is still a significant improvement.
And lastly, what is the raw? Do you have a raw brand that you particularly recommend that you like, or
So
maybe you don't want to say? I don't know.
I'd say like one of the ones I reach for the most is like small batch, and they're nice because they have a range, they have raw, freeze dried, and gently cooked. Um, you know, I wish I can say I had the time to really like know everything that I could about, dog food brands. But there's only so much time and so, that so many things my brain can hold. So I do think that Susan Thixton and that Truth About Pet Food, her like annual reviews of different pet foods is a great resource. So it's truthaboutpetfood.com. And annually she reaches out to a lot of the pet food companies and gets like their guaranteed analysis, asks the hard questions about like where their food is processed and like what type of facility where the food is coming from. And so she has a top 30-ish plus list now for cats and dogs, and a treat list even now that has a mix of like the raw, gently cooked, freeze dried. There's some kibble on there. So I think it's a great like bouncing off point. Because like I said, things change too. Like in this specific example, like for Tess and Emma, she had tried to put Emma on Darwin's and she had success with her dogs previously, but I know somewhere in the last maybe 2 or 3 years they changed their formulation slightly, and she thought it was originally because of that, not that the dog had underlying glyphosate, but that's what we were originally attributing it to. So keeping up, like even if a dog food brand has been like a trusted brand, that doesn't mean things don't change.
Very good. Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for an enlightful discussion on this topic of these hidden toxins. I mean, I'm telling you right now, with like mycotoxins, with all the
Mhm.
submissions that we're seeing right now, it's more than half
Yeah.
are positive for some form of mycotoxins. Glyphosate, of course, is sadly. I think we all have some level of glyphosate
Yeah.
in us. I think it's almost
Yeah.
impossible to get away from.
Yeah.
But I do want to thank you for sharing with us these cases. And I also want to add to our viewers that if any of you might have some interest in coming on to a webinar like this and sharing some cases and some interesting thing with the community and the colleagues, please give us a call, and maybe that's something we can arrange with you. So again, my name is Randy, Chief Technology Officer of VDI Laboratory, and I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for our webinar with Dr. Marino, and thank you again for this evening.